Hey y'all, thanks so much for ordering my new book, Master of Change. I'm really excited for you to read the book and for you to get to dive into this mini masterclass on the book. So what I hope to do here is go into some of the key insights, dive even layers deeper, prime you for reading the book, and ideally have you leave with some really helpful concepts, tools, and practices to master change and develop this concept that I call rugged flexibility in your own life. We're living in a time of accelerating and intensifying change. Not a decade goes by where we aren't faced with some sort of major societal disruptor. This could be a pandemic, it can be war, it can be the emergence of new technologies like the internet and now artificial intelligence. Meanwhile, in our personal lives, change is even more common. We start school, we graduate from school. We get married, we get divorced. We start new jobs, we end jobs, we change jobs. We have kids, we become empty nesters. We make friends, we lose friends, and on and on and on. We think that change is the exception, that it's something that happens to us, that it's a one-off event, when in reality, change is one of the only constants there is. It's an ongoing part of our lives. And herein lies a central problem in our culture. We feel very underpowered amidst change, and it's for no fault of our own. We've been taught for the longest time that the way to be stable through change is by trying to control change, or resist change, or even delude ourselves and pretend that change isn't happening at all. As a result, we often get swallowed by it, and we fare a lot worse. It can be helpful to think of life as ongoing cycles of order, disorder, and reorder. So yes, we crave stability, but the way to achieve that stability is by changing, by being in conversation with change, whether that change is internal in ourselves or external in our environments. A key skill can help. It's called rugged flexibility. Now, you might hear these two terms and think of them as being diametrically opposed. To be rugged is to be tough, to be durable, to know your values and what you stand for. To be flexible is to bend easily without breaking, to be highly adaptable. When you put them together, what you get is an anti-fragility that can bend but not break, that can withstand change, grow in its midst by, to some extent, changing. This book aims to do a couple of core things. The first, redefine change. Change is not something that happens to us. Change is something that is an ongoing part of life. The second, change our view so that we can be in conversation with change, so that we can realize that yes, we are shaped by change, but we also can shape change. We can take wise and productive and skillful action in its midst. And finally, it introduces this term rugged flexibility along with the habits and practices it takes to cultivate this mindset and use it in your day-to-day life. To be rugged and flexible throughout change is ultimately how to navigate it to be better, stronger, and wiser as a result. Another way in which we're confronted with change is within ourselves. What does it mean to have a strong and enduring identity when everything is always changing, including us? And that's a question that I really pay attention to in this book, because we want to be excellent over time. And if we just go with the flow always, if we don't really stand for anything, well, that's not a great way to live life. But on the flip side, if we become too rigid and we fall into patterns of resistance and refusal, that's not really comfortable, nor is that a productive way to be either. And then there's the perennial ongoing change, which is the change to ourselves. What does it mean to excel and have a strong identity when everything is always changing, including us? The ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus famously said that you can't step into the same river twice. And our identities are a lot like that river. They both are and they are not, because they are constantly changing. And in the book, I really try to grapple with this question of identity and to come up with frameworks and models to think of ourselves as strong and stable and enduring, while at the same time realizing that we ourselves are always changing, and that these two things that are commonly thought of as oppositional to each other can actually go together quite harmoniously and lead to excellence, fulfillment, and ultimately some wisdom in our own lives. The big misconception with change is really rooted in history. And we have been taught that the predominant model for change is what people refer to as homeostasis, which says that living systems thrive when they have stability. And that's true, I'm going to come back to that. But what homeostasis has gotten wrong is it says that a system is stable, has some sort of disorder event or change occur, and then tries to get back to where it was. So you can signify this as a cycle of order, disorder, order. Now, that's been the prevailing model for over 100 years, but more recently, scientists have described a much more accurate and better fit model for thinking about change. And that is order, disorder, reorder. So yes, healthy living systems crave stability, but that stability is constantly reinventing itself. It's not a stability that resists change. It's not a stability that tries to control change. It's a stability that is in an ongoing conversation with change. So that last topic that I talked about, researchers refer to as allostasis, which literally translates to stability through change. And I love this because it has such an elegant double meaning. Yes, we want to be stable through change, and the way to be stable through change is by changing, or at least to some extent. If you don't want to lose your footing, you've got to keep moving. And stability through change really represents another key theme in the book, which is called non-dual thinking. And what non-dual thinking says is that a lot of fundamental truths are actually found in paradox. So in the West, we're taught to think in a very linear way. It's either this or that. And linear thinking is not a bad thing at all. It underlies the scientific method and Western reason. However, sometimes it falls short because a lot of things in life are not this or that, they're this and that. And when it comes to change, it is so important to understand this. The goal is not to relinquish all stability and just say to heck with it. I'm just going to go wherever the current takes me, because you don't know where you'll end up and it might not always be such a good place. However, it's equally negative to say I'm never going to change. I'm going to be stable. I'm going to resist change as much as I can. I'm going to try to control change. So rather than think of stability or change, it's helpful to think of stability through change. And an ongoing theme in the book is this kind of non-dual thinking. One of the biggest traps where we fall short, where we mess up in the face of change, is we think way too dualistically. This is good or this is bad. I need to do this or I need to do that, when in fact the answer is often non-dual. Not this or that, but this and that. Another profound example of non-dual thinking that appears in the book is this concept called tragic optimism. And it was first coined by the psychoanalyst and Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl. And Frankl writes so eloquently and taught so eloquently that life is full of inevitable tragedy. We age, we get ill, we die. Bad things happen. That's a very extreme sample. So we don't want to be toxically positive and Pollyanna and pretend that everything is good all the time. However, he takes tragedy and combines it with being optimistic, with optimism. And what optimism means in Frankl's view is, again, not that we bury our heads in the sand, not that we embrace toxic positivity, but rather that we accept life's inevitable suffering and hardship, and we do everything we can to trudge forward with a positive attitude nonetheless. And what's fascinating is that by accepting the suffering and the pain that's inherent to life, instead of resisting it or pretending it's not true or trying to smile our way through really crappy circumstances, it allows us to be more hopeful. Because once we accept the really hard stuff, it becomes a little bit less scary. One of my personally favorite parts of the book in terms of doing research and reporting was the section on identity. And in particular, this notion of self-complexity, which says that we want to diversify our identities so that when we have a major change in one area of our lives, we can find stability in others. And this is somewhat counterintuitive because common wisdom would say that in order to be great at something, you kind of have to go all in. I mean, it's in the subtitle of a book that I co-wrote with Steve, right? The Passion Paradox, the benefits of going all in. However, I think that it's okay to go all in, but you have to have other areas of your life that are available in case that all-in nature fails. Or, as it so often does, as it inevitably does, changes. So a real extreme example is an Olympic athlete whose sole identity is being an athlete. And that can be great if they're winning and they're thriving. But when their career starts to falter, it's often accompanied by anxiety and depression, because it's not just that they're faltering as an athlete, it's that their whole identity is dissipating. And this also happens during times of transition and retirement for athletes. So the advice here is to develop a sense of self that has multiple buckets available. And you don't have to fill all those buckets at the same time. It's okay to just focus on one, but you want to make sure that when that one stops working or changing, there are some others that you can go to. So in my own life, I try to practice this. And my big buckets are my family, my career, my writing, and even within my career, there's writing, there's coaching, myself as an athlete, my weightlifting, and then myself as a member of the community. And it's very hard to go all in on any of those things at the same time. I have different seasons, but I make sure to never leave any of those behind. Because when my kids move out of the house, that's going to be really hard. That will be a very dramatic, disruptive change in my life. And that will be a time to perhaps pour myself more into some of those other buckets. When my creative work hits a lull, that is also a really challenging time, but I can shift into focusing on my family. I love sport. It's something that is so objective, so concrete. It's a huge part of my identity as an athlete, but I am aging. I'm not the athlete that I was, and in years to come, I won't be the athlete that I am now. So putting too much of my identity and connecting it to that can also be problematic. So I want to be really clear. It's not to say that we should be quote unquote balanced, that we should do equal things in equal proportion. What it is to say is that we should define ourselves and how we think about ourselves in a diversified way, so that when big changes happen, yes, it's hard, but it's not like our entire self is under attack. Core values come up repeatedly in the book, and I like to view core values as the bank of a metaphorical river, and that river is us. So you think about a river, and it's always flowing, it's always changing, and we're always flowing, we're always changing. But a river without a bank is not a river. It's just chaotic water going everywhere. And for our own identities and our own lives, our core values make up the bank of our river. So they guide the flow. When change happens, we can use our core values to ask ourselves, how do we want to be in conversation with it? How do we want to try to shape it? So back to this non-dual term, rugged flexibility. I think core values are a big part of our ruggedness. When you know your core values, the things that you really stand for, what you aspire toward, those don't have to change. They can, but they don't have to. Those are the hills that you die on. What changes over time is how you apply those core values. A big example in my own life is my participation in sport. So I have a core value of health. Now, that is very different than saying that my core value is as a football player, or as a runner, or as a power lifter. And here's why that's important. Because over time, as I've changed, I have changed how I practice the core value of health. At one point in my life, it was running marathons. And then I got injured. I had an orthopedic condition. It required surgery. It basically told me that I need to hang up my running shoes. That was hard, but my core value wasn't as a runner, it was to be healthy. And there are multiple ways to practice exercise. So I shifted to powerlifting. At some point, I probably won't be able to, or I won't want to powerlift. But again, that won't be like my whole identity goes away. That will just mean it's time to find another way to practice that core value of health. So when we have our core values, again, they make up the bank that helps guide the flow, but the flexible part is in how we apply those core values. So when the environment around us changes, we can ask, hey, what would it look like to practice my core values in this new environment? And I alluded to this earlier, but it's okay for our core values to change too. But even then, it's our current core values and practicing those that lead us to our new ones. So the stability that we get through change is by knowing what we stand for, knowing our values, and being comfortable practicing them and applying them in different ways. The book spends a lot of time discussing the role of expectancy and expectations in navigating change. The brain is a prediction machine. It's constantly setting predictions for what it expects is going to happen next. And part of the reason that change throws us off is because the predictions prove to be wrong. And some people hear this and they say, well, then the goal is probably to set negative expectations or maybe not so optimistic expectations. And perhaps that makes the most sense given the person in their unique situation. But I actually think like the ultimate goal here is to try to release from an attachment to any expectation and just to confront reality as it is. So it's not that we can't be optimistic and we can't have hopeful expectations. We can do that so long as when reality proves our expectations wrong, we're very quickly able to update. I think it's better to be optimistic and to have hopeful expectations than to always have really crappy expectations, especially for yourself, right? How can you change in a productive direction if your expectations for yourself are that it's never going to work out? So it's not about setting negative or poor expectations. It's about not becoming too attached to positive expectations, to being able to very quickly release from what you thought would happen and adapt to and be in conversation with what is happening. And this is so hard to do, but it's really important. The book goes into all these strategies for self-distancing, right? To pretend that you're giving advice to a friend. Some of these things I've written about before. I think what changes in this book on these topics is just how hard it really is, right? Our consciousness is one flowing prediction of what's going to happen next. And to be able to break out of that really requires a lot of self-awareness. Asking the question, am I stuck? Am I resisting change? Am I experiencing distress because I thought something was going to go this way and it turned out to go that way? Is so powerful. I go back to the example that I use in the book of the Delta variant with COVID, where everyone was so happy because we thought that COVID was over for a 3-month period of time. Here where I live in Asheville, I remember there were like 4 cases a week and it was back to normal. Back to normal. Man, were we wrong, because it wasn't back to normal. We were headed for a new normal. And then the Delta variant came and it felt like such a gut punch. Now, objectively, things were better than they had been at the start of COVID. We had effective vaccinations. We had learned more about how the virus is transmitted, how it's mitigated. We had more tools. We realized that we could actually be outside and probably not infect each other. Yet it felt worse to so many people, myself included, than it did at the start of the pandemic. Now, why is this the case? Because our expectation had shifted to this pandemic is over. And I think where pain turned into suffering is when people couldn't quickly release from that expectation and realize, all right, now we're living with the Delta variant. This sucks, but it actually sucks less than it did at the start of the pandemic because we have these tools. So what can we do to live as effectively and productively as possible given this new normal? And it's an extreme example, but some sort of process like that ought to constantly be happening in our lives because things are always changing. Now I want to spend a little bit of time talking about one of the central themes in the book, which is this notion of rugged flexibility. I think it's a core mindset and practice to navigate and grow from change. To be rugged is to be durable, to be tough, to know what you stand for, to be very gritty. To be flexible is to bend easily without breaking, to adapt to changing circumstances, to show yourself and your environment some grace. Put these two terms together, the result is rugged flexibility, an anti-fragility that can withstand change, that can shape change, that can be shaped by change, and that can grow in its midst. Embracing non-dual thinking, so important. Many things in life are this or that, but many things in life are also this and that. And when it comes to matters of change, I encourage you not to ask yourself if this is true, but to ask yourself in what context or in what situation is this true? And to remember that terms that we often think of as diametrically opposed, stability and change, ruggedness and flexibility, enduring identity and shifting identity, resistance and engagement, they often are complementary, and they're most powerful when we can hold both these ideas at the same time and when we can even apply them at the same time. Really important is to adopt what the psychoanalyst Erich Fromm would call a being over a having orientation. A having orientation, you define yourself based on what you achieve and what you have at a given point of time. A being orientation, you define yourself on your essence, or what I would say are your core values, the ongoing process of your life, the things that you always stand for. This is important because what you have will always change and it will always be taken away. Whether it's a promotion, whether it's a specific skill, the things that we have are constantly shifting. And if we identify with the things that we have, if we orient around those things, we become really fragile for when they change, when they're taken away. Whereas a being orientation, that is so indestructible. If you identify as having a great marathon time and you get injured or you age out of it, well then who are you as a runner? But if you identify as being an athlete, that is something that you can practice for your whole life. And of course, that's but one example. This applies across the board. As I mentioned earlier, expectancy plays a really big role in change. And I would constantly ask yourself, hey, especially when there's a change, I would ask yourself, hey, have I updated my expectations or am I clinging on to old expectations? And if it's the latter, try to see as clearly as you can, update those expectations, and even if doing so in the moment kind of feels like a downer, in the long run, it will free you up to take powerful and productive action in the new situation. We talked about tragic optimism earlier, and one way to practice it is what I call wise hope and wise action. And this is a concept that I developed in the thick of the pandemic. And what I realized is that in the cultural conversation, there were these two broad themes. On the one hand, there was a group of people who really found themselves falling into utter despair and public hopelessness. How dare you be happy? Nothing good can possibly happen. We're going through this terrible pandemic. Being hopeful was almost like a sin. On the other hand, the other extreme, there were people that engaged in what I would call toxic positivity or Pollyanna thinking, which is everything is great. This isn't that big of a deal. And I think that what happens is you get this discourse, especially on the internet, where these two extremes feed off of each other. And if you're positive, you're burying your head in the sand, you're a terrible person, but then the alternative is just to be completely negative all the time. And you see this not only with the pandemic, you see this with a lot of thorny issues. When there is a huge chasm between despair and toxic positivity. And I think the hard work, the work of being a mature person in the world, is to try to exist in that middle ground. So what is wise hope? It is realizing that sometimes things really suck and that there is a lot of pain and that things are not as they ought to be or as they wish or as we wish they should be. But still maintaining hope that they can get better. In the book I write, and it's one of my favorite lines, that to fix a broken world, we can't become broken people. We can't just fall into despair. On the other hand, we need to take wise action. It's not enough just to hope. So what productive actions can we take? Even when we're faced with what seems like overwhelming large forces against us, we've got to be able to take small actions because every single big change, whether it's in our own intimate lives or in the world as a whole, started with small actions. And if we convince ourselves, if we let the internet convince ourselves that we've lost all agency, that nothing we do matters, not only will we not be able to affect positive change, but we'll feel really crappy too. Because taking productive action is one of the best antidotes for depression and despair. Having multiple selves, the concept that we discussed earlier on, or self-complexity as I called it, really relies on these two forces, and researchers call this differentiation and integration. So differentiation means diversifying, as we talked about, having multiple rooms in which your identity can go at any given point of time. Now, integration is finding a way to connect those rooms in your personal narrative and the story you tell about yourself so that you can become this cohesive whole. So let's say that the hats that you wear are knowledge worker or executive or founder or physician or athlete, whatever you do for your career. And then there's another hat you wear that is community member. And then there's another hat that you wear that might have to do with your hobby. If you're not a pro athlete, maybe it's an athletic pursuit. Maybe it's gardening. Maybe it's chess. Maybe it's as a video gamer or a coder on the side. And then there's still another hat that you wear, which is as somebody that loves to read. Now, that's great to have that level of diversification, but it's even more powerful if you can integrate those things into a cohesive whole. You can have each of those things support other of those things. And we see this in really highly differentiated and integrated people as they develop this sense of robustness to their identity, where it can withstand all sorts of change because it has all of these different interacting parts. And no one change can disrupt all those different interacting parts to a point where it would really knock that person out. So think about diversifying your sense of self, having those different aspects of your identity, but then also being able to integrate and connect those aspects so that they complement one another, they support one another, they make you more robust, more strong, more able to withstand and navigate change. Coming back to the unsung hero of the book, perhaps, non-dual thinking, another profound example that I now use often in my life as a result of researching and reporting on this book is this notion of viewing the world with both an independent and an interdependent lens. An independent lens says that I am an actor with agency. There are some things that I can control, and I can act on those things. Philosophers call this the will to power. I can do things that exert the change that I want. And that is true. However, that's not the only truth. There's another truth, an interdependent lens, that says that I am constantly being shaped by everything that's happening around me. In my actions, the effect of those actions will often also be shaped by everything that's happening around me. There are certain times when an independent lens, when exerting that control, makes a lot of sense. For instance, you're doing a task at work where you are the sole contributor, or you're an athlete that is swimming across a pool where there really aren't too many changing variables. You're indoors, there's water in the pool. There, it can be really helpful to have an independent lens to say, hey, I'm going to control the controllables, and there are a lot, and I'm going to take ownership for the result. However, there are other situations in life where there's tons of complexity. Parenting, as an example. Working on a team where there's many different people with many different incentives and working styles. In there, trying to over-control, having that independent lens, it often backfires, and we need to develop an interdependent lens where we think about all the moving parts and not just what our part does to affect change, but how our part fits in with and is shaped by all those other moving parts. So it's not independent or interdependent, it's independent and interdependent. It's being able to switch between these two ways of viewing the world and acting in the world, and at times even practice both on the same day for the same project. I'd be remiss not to mention a mnemonic because people love these. And it's actually not really a mnemonic, it's just using 4 Ps to remember a way to respond instead of react to change. And responding to something is deliberate, it's thoughtful, it uses our highest self, our consciousness, our best thinking. Reacting is rash. So reacting, the 2 Ps. Very different than panicking and pummeling ahead, the 2 Ps is the 4 Ps. So first we pause. We take a deep breath, we step back. Then we process. We do the work of updating our expectations. We stop seeing the world as we thought it would be, and we start seeing the world as it is. Then we develop a plan. What are we going to do in this new world? How are these new expectations going to shape our actions? How are our actions potentially going to shape this new world? And then we proceed. We take those actions. And we can constantly repeat this loop over and over again. So remember, reactivity, reacting to change, we panic, we pummel ahead. That's the default. What we want to try to practice is a more effortful, deliberate way of being in conversation with change. The 4 Ps, we pause, we process what's happening, we update our expectations, we make a thoughtful plan, then we proceed, and we can go through this cycle over and over again. Routines come up towards the back end of the book when I spend a lot of time discussing changes that we don't really want and that we certainly don't bring upon ourselves. So big disruptors, earthquakes to our personal or organizational lives. And when these changes happen, we often need to relinquish a lot of our control. We do need to flow with them, lest we'll be swallowed by them. Because trying to do too much, it just backfires, right? We're resisting this enormous wave that's coming whether we like it or not. So we've got to be able to ride the wave. But, as I've stated, rugged flexibility, we also want to be rugged. Thriving systems, they want stability. So what can really help when we're facing a huge external change that we didn't bring about is to have some area of our life that feels very stable and very predictable. And here, routine goes such a long way to help. Why? Because when we have a routine, even if it's just in a small component of our life, it allows us to have something that we show up and we do every day that is really predictable. So the common example is the person who is going through a really ugly, grisly divorce, or who is just laid off and now needs to look for a new job, or who maybe was diagnosed with a really crappy prognosis illness. They show up and they do their run every day. or they go in the garden and they water their plants every day, or they even do something as simple as quilting or the New York Times crossword or the Wall Street Journal crossword puzzle. Now, it's nothing magical about those specific things, but the magic is it gives us one element of our lives where we can feel stable and we do have control. And that one element of our lives where we feel stable and we have control, it allows us to show up for all that change more calmly and with more of a level head. So a recent example from my personal life is having an infant at home, which really blows up most of your routine. But I made sure, even in the earliest days, to have an agreement with my wife where every day I could do 30 to 45 minutes of physical activity. Even if that meant just going for a walk, strapping the baby on my chest with the baby carrier. Now, was there anything super special happening physically about that walk? Probably not. But what it was is that I just knew that I could do this thing, I could control this thing, which then allowed me to embrace so much of the other chaos. So it's not over controlling, it's not relying too heavily on routine, it's picking your spots and making sure that there's always something that's predictable when everything else feels unpredictable. It's one of my favorite topics. It's a central theme in the practice of groundedness, and of course it's going to come up in this book too, because I think it's one of these universal concepts, and that is behavioral activation. This notion that we think that we need to feel good and motivated to get going, but often we need to get going to give ourselves a chance to feel good and to feel motivated. How does this impact change? How does this play out during change? Well, often during big periods of change, they can feel very exhausting and very fatiguing, particularly when we're feeling overwhelmed. We can lose motivation. We can feel like, oh, this is just too much to bear. This is just too much to take on. I'm just gonna stay in bed, or I'm just not gonna deal with it. Now remember, part of mastering change, part of rugged flexibility is being in conversation with change. But we're not always motivated to be in conversation with change. Sometimes we'd rather just say, you know what, this is gonna wash over me. It is what it is. During those moments, this is where behavioral activation can really help, where we can tell ourselves, I don't have to feel like I want to get started. I don't have to feel like I want to engage with this. I don't have to feel like I want to do anything productive, but I'm going to just get started anyways. I'm going to pick that one thing that I can do to display some tragic optimism, wise hope and wise action, and I'm going to commit to showing up and executing on it regardless of how I feel. Some days, it's going to turn my feelings around. I'll feel great. Other days, I'll still feel like crap, but at least I'm giving myself a chance. Now, related to behavioral activation, and something that is new in this book, is this dichotomy between what I like to call real fatigue and fake fatigue. And real fatigue occurs when our physical and psychological system is truly run down. In those situations, what we need to do is we need to rest. No amount of behavioral activation is going to help. We need to take a very long nap and spend some time on the couch, hanging out, watching Netflix, reading a book, whatever it is. However, there are also times when we feel what I call fake fatigue. And this is when we're in a rut, when we're sleeping well, when we're resting, when there's no reason for us to be tired, yet we're still feeling exhausted. And this is the kind of fatigue that often responds really well to behavioral activation, to just nudging ourselves into action. And the complex trap that I unpack in the book that I'll spend just a minute talking about here is how often what starts out as real fatigue becomes fake fatigue. So the example is there's some massive change that you face and you're doing everything you can to ride these waves, and as a result you get really exhausted. You're genuinely physically and psychologically spent. So you go into a period of rest and recovery. You shut things down. But then the body gets really used to rest and recovery. And maybe you've been resting and recovering for 4 days or a week or 2 weeks or even a month. Yet you're still feeling really exhausted, you're still feeling tired. And here, no amount of additional rest is going to help you. What you need to do is nudge yourself into productive action. This is when getting going and then letting the feelings follow make a lot of sense. And what's fascinating is you see this in professional athletes all the time. The way that a well-trained athlete tapers is just that. They shut things down and they do a period of rest. But then in the days before the event, they start doing some short, intense efforts. Why? Because they have to wake their body up. They have to get a little bit of mood follows action going before they can perform at their best. So there's real fatigue, you're exhausted. There's fake fatigue, you're in a rut, your body's telling you you're exhausted, but you're not. And then there's real fatigue, resting, picking up an inertia, turning into fake fatigue, where acting your way out is probably often the best path forward. I want to close this mini masterclass with arguably the most important topic of the book, at least for me and I presume for many readers. Picking up a book like this, you want to learn the skills to engage with change, to grow, to shape things. In 95% of the circumstances, we can do those things, and we can do those things really quickly. However, there are certain things that happen in our lives that just suck. The loss of a loved one, the onset of a really severe illness, war, abuse, harassment. And one of the biggest traps that people fall into, especially optimistic people, the kind of people that want to read this kind of book, is that they assume that those things need to be meaningful and lead to growth, and they assume that those things have to happen immediately. So they try to force meaning and growth on an otherwise really crappy experience. They say, oh, well, even though I'm going through this, even though I've lost a loved one, even though I was just diagnosed with this illness, even though my country's at war, I can grow from this. I can gain wisdom from this. I can be stronger. I can be stable through this. And if that works, great. All the power to you. But if you find that that's not working, the best thing that you can do is release from all of this and just focus on showing up, getting through, and being kind to yourself. That's it. That's the personal growth. For a super personal growth oriented person, sometimes the personal growth is to release from the notion of personal growth altogether, to just survive and let that be enough. Now, the ironic thing is that if you can do that, if you can just survive, if you can just let it be enough, most of the time, there is some growth and meaning on the other side of these harrowing events. However, it has to occur on its own time. It cannot be forced. There are things that we can do to help usher it in, to help us continue to show up, but we should not layer on the expectation that everything has to be inherently meaningful, that we need to grow from suffering, that we need to find some sort of positive in all the negatives. We have to allow ourselves to realize that, hey, life is really hard. And when shit hits the fan, it is just enough to show up and to continue trudging forward. And then let the meaning, let the growth take care of itself. A big thank you for getting a copy of Master of Change. I hope that you found this mini masterclass valuable, and I really hope that you find the book valuable. If you do, please share it with your colleagues, your friends, your family. I firmly believe that the more of us that are working on these principles, that are wrestling with these ideas, that are giving language for these really ambiguous, tough experiences to navigate, the better. So again, thank you so much. I appreciate all of you. Keep going, and here's to navigating and growing from change together.